Good morning, everybody. Overnight, the waters around the Strait of Hormuz got a whole lot more dangerous. Fresh imagery and new reporting indicate that Iran has surged hundreds of fast attack boats into the battle space, massing small, fast, heavily armed craft in and around one of the most strategically sensitive waterways on planet Earth. And if that sounds like a stunt, if that sounds like theater, if that sounds like some kind of maritime photo op, think again. Because in this region, in this corridor, with tensions already stacked sky high, even small boats can create massive consequences. And here's the part that should have every commander in the Gulf sitting a little straighter in the chair this morning. The U.S. military did not wait around. It reacted fast. Air assets went up. Surveillance tightened. Naval posture shifted. The whole kill chain started waking up. And that tells you something immediately. This was not treated like background noise. This was not treated like harmless flexing. This was read for what it could become. A swarm threat inside a global choke point. So today we are going to break down exactly what happened, why these fast attack boats matter far more than people think, what the U.S. response tells us, and why the next 24 to 72 hours could be some of the most important in this entire standoff. Because what we are watching right now is not just boats moving through water. We are watching deterrence collide with doctrine. We are watching signaling collide with firepower. And we may be watching the opening moves of a maritime showdown that could reshape the entire Gulf picture in a matter of hours. But before we get into the response, before we get into the aircraft, the naval screening, the ISR picture, and the wider strategy, let's start with the most important point of all. Do not make the mistake of laughing off these boats because they're small. That is exactly how asymmetric warfare gets underestimated right up until the moment it becomes everybody's problem. Because Iran does not need a blue water navy to create danger in the Strait of Hormuz. It does not need aircraft carriers. It does not need destroyers sailing in parade formation. What it needs is speed, density, coastal access, local geography, and the willingness to use confusion as a weapon. That is where fast attack boats come in. These craft are not designed to win some classic fleet-on-fleet naval war. That is not the job. The job is disruption. The job is harassment. The job is saturation. The job is to force larger, more advanced militaries to divide their attention, spend expensive munitions, change routing, alter tempo, and make hard decisions in compressed time. And there is almost no place on Earth better suited for that kind of pressure than the Strait of Hormuz. That is the key. This isn't just any patch of water. This is the world's energy artery. This is one of the most important maritime choke points on the planet. A huge portion of globally traded oil and gas passes through here. Commercial shipping threads through a narrow, vulnerable corridor. Tankers, escorts, surveillance aircraft, patrol ships, drones, regional militaries, global markets. It all converges here. So when fast attack boats start massing in serious numbers, the danger is not measured only by what those boats can physically destroy. The danger is measured by what they can trigger. Insurance panic. Shipping reroutes. Miscalculation. Warning shots. Escalation spirals. Political pressure. A bad decision in a narrow waterway. That is why this matters. And here's what makes this even more serious. This kind of deployment is not random. Boats do not just magically appear in organized numbers, in tactical groupings, in a high-tension zone, at a moment when every military in the region is already watching the map. This kind of move sends a message. Iran is signaling that even if its larger conventional maritime options are under pressure, even if its broader strategic environment has become more dangerous, it can still generate a credible asymmetric threat where it hurts the most. It can still say to the region and to Washington, you may dominate the skies. You may dominate the deep water fight. But right here, in this narrow corridor, under these conditions, you still have to deal with us. That is the message. And the U.S. military's fast reaction is a message right back. Because when the American response comes quickly, when surveillance posture increases, when aircraft are visible, when naval forces start tightening formation and readiness, that is not just tactical. That is strategic language. That is Washington and the regional command structure saying, we saw it. We understood it. And if this moves from signaling to action, we are already in position. Now let's zoom in on the military reality here because this is where a lot of people get lost. When people hear fast attack boats, they imagine a few speedboats with machine guns zipping around causing chaos. And yes, at the lowest level that image exists. But in actual military terms, the real threat comes from swarm doctrine. Swarm tactics are dangerous because they weaponize numbers, speed, and angles. Instead of one large vessel presenting one large radar track and one obvious threat axis, you get multiple smaller contacts. They can disperse. They can regroup. They can approach from different directions. Some can probe. Some can distract. Some can carry rockets or anti-ship weapons. Some can just force you to light up your defenses and reveal your pattern. The objective is not always to sink a warship in one glorious moment. Sometimes the objective is to overwhelm the decision cycle. And that's what makes this kind of deployment so dangerous in a narrow maritime corridor. The defending force has to see everything, classify everything, track everything, and make correct decisions fast. Which contacts are real threats? Which ones are feints? Which ones are armed? Which ones are trying to close distance? Which ones are trying to draw fire? Which ones are cueing something bigger from the shore? Every second counts. Every wrong call has consequences. And here's the brutal reality. Even if the United States has overwhelming superiority, and it does, superiority does not eliminate complexity. It just gives you more tools to survive it. So what does a fast U.S. military reaction actually mean in this situation? It likely means the Americans immediately moved to tighten the sensor picture. That means more eyes in the sky, more ISR, more airborne surveillance, more radar coverage, more data fusion, more attention to maritime tracks, launch points, coastal staging areas, and support movements. Because before you ever get to the shooting part, you need the picture. If you own the picture, you own the decision cycle. And if you own the decision cycle, you can start collapsing a swarm into sectors, priorities, and targets. That is the first layer. The second layer is air power. And this is where the whole equation starts to look very ugly for any massed fast attack boat force that pushes too far. Because once you have fighters overhead, helicopters in the area, maritime surveillance feeding real-time tracks, and naval shooters integrated into one operating picture, the swarm starts losing its mystery. It starts becoming targetable. And the second a swarm becomes targetable, its psychological power begins to drop and its survival odds begin to drop with it. That does not mean the threat disappears. Not at all. It means the race begins. Can the swarm create confusion faster than the US and its partners can create order? That is the real contest. And I want to pause here because this is the part many casual observers miss. The response is not just send jets, destroy boats. That sounds clean in a headline. Real military operations are messier and smarter than that. The first question is not always, how do we kill the boats? Sometimes the better question is, how do we break the system that makes the boats dangerous? That means looking beyond the boats themselves. Where are they staging from? Where are they getting cueing from? What coastal sites are supporting them? What communication nodes are holding the swarm together? What radar or drone layers are feeding them awareness? What fuel points, what inlets, what hidden anchorages, what command links are making this deployment possible? Because one fast attack boat is a threat. A coordinated fast attack boat network is a real operational problem. And networks can be disrupted. That is why the US reaction matters so much. If American commanders believed this was just posturing, you would not see a serious tightening of posture. But when the response comes quickly, what it tells us is simple. Somebody is taking the possibility of escalation seriously enough to get ahead of it. And frankly, they should. Because the Strait of Hormuz is not forgiving. This is not the open ocean where you have room to breathe and layers of maneuver space. This is compressed geography. Shipping lanes are constrained. Coastlines matter. Islands matter. Sensor clutter matters. Civilian traffic matters. Reaction time shrinks. Ambiguity rises. And ambiguity is where accidents are born. That is why these moments are so dangerous. Not necessarily because either side wakes up and decides, today we begin a full regional war. But because one side pushes too close, one side misreads intent, one side sees a hostile profile where the other side thinks it's still only signaling, and suddenly you have tracers, smoke, missile warnings, helicopters moving, ships going hard defensive, and a crisis that has jumped the rails in minutes. That is how these things start. And that is why both sides are speaking in force posture right now. Iran's signal is quantity and proximity. America's signal is speed and readiness. Iran is saying, we can still crowd the water. The United States is saying, and we can still dominate the response. Now let's talk about why Iran would choose this move right now. Because this is not just about hardware. It's about leverage. If you are under pressure, if your strategic room is narrowing, if your conventional options are more limited than they used to be, then asymmetric pressure becomes more valuable, not less. You look for places where a relatively cheap move can create an outsized political effect. You look for places where the global economy itself becomes part of your pressure campaign. You look for places where your enemy's strength can be complicated by geography. That is exactly what the Strait of Hormuz offers. Iran does not need to prove it can win a traditional naval war in order to create fear in this corridor. It only needs to prove that it can make the price of transit, escort, and confrontation rise fast enough to get everybody's attention. It needs to make governments nervous. It needs to make markets nervous. It needs to make commanders cautious. It needs to remind the world that geography is still on its side. And from the American side, the response has to do the opposite. The United States has to show that no matter how many boats get stacked into the picture, the corridor will not be surrendered psychologically. Commercial movement will not be abandoned. Maritime pressure will not be allowed to become a new normal. And perhaps most importantly, the idea that swarming creates immunity has to be crushed before it takes root. Because if that perception spreads, if regional actors start believing that mass small craft can effectively paralyze strategic waterways under U.S. watch, then deterrence suffers. And once deterrence starts to erode, the whole region gets more dangerous. This is why the reaction had to be fast. Not just to respond, but to answer the message. And now we get to the really important part. What happens next? Because this is where the story stops being about a single deployment and starts becoming about scenarios. Scenario 1 is controlled intimidation. In that scenario, Iran keeps the boats active enough to maintain pressure and visibility, but not so aggressive that they cross the threshold into a clear engagement trigger. The U.S. keeps aircraft up, keeps surveillance tight, keeps escorts ready, maybe repositions some naval assets, and both sides continue playing this dangerous signaling game without firing the first serious shot. That is the most stable version of instability. Scenario 2 is the warning shot spiral. This is where a close approach, a dangerous maneuver, an aggressive intercept, or a radar cue gets interpreted the wrong way. Maybe somebody fires warning shots. Maybe helicopters move lower. Maybe a ship goes to hard alert. Maybe a boat ignores directions. Suddenly everyone is one bad second away from kinetic escalation. This scenario is more likely than many people want to admit, because narrow water and armed signaling are a bad combination. Scenario 3 is selective punishment. This is the one where the United States decides that visible posture is not enough and that some element of the swarm architecture, a launch point, a command node, a support site, an armed grouping pushing too far, has to be hit quickly and decisively. That would not just be a tactical move. That would be a declaration that the line had been crossed and that restoration of deterrence required visible damage. Scenario 4 is the nightmare path. A regional chain reaction. One clash becomes two. Then shore-based systems get involved. Then shipping gets rerouted at scale. Then markets react hard. Then allies and proxies reposition. Then everyone starts talking about escalation management after escalation has already begun. Hopefully we are not there. But you would be foolish not to see the path. And this is why, in moments like this, intelligence and discipline matter more than rhetoric. Because the military side of this equation is brutally simple. If the United States gets clean tracks, keeps the air overhead, maintains integrated command and control, and refuses to get tactically surprised, then a swarm of fast attack boats becomes a highly risky proposition for the side deploying it. But if the water gets cluttered, if civilian traffic gets mixed in, if the engagement envelope becomes politically constrained, if there's hesitation at the wrong moment, then even a weaker force can create a major incident. That is asymmetric warfare in a sentence. It doesn't have to win cleanly. It just has to make order expensive. And that is exactly why fast attack boats are still relevant in 2026. Not because they are magical. Not because they are invincible. But because they are perfectly built for a world where cameras, confusion, choke points, and political pressure all matter almost as much as firepower. Now, before we move to the final strategic read, here is the part that should really grab your attention. The U.S. reaction itself may be the biggest story. Because when a military reacts fast, it means one of two things. Either it was already expecting this kind of move, or it believes the move could turn operational very quickly. And either way, that tells you the tension level is not low. You do not surge your attention and sharpen your posture around a global energy choke point because somebody parked a few boats for a photo. You do it because there is at least some concern that the posture could become a problem very fast. And I think that is the correct read here. This is not casual. This is not noise. This is a contest of signaling inside one of the most dangerous waterways in the world. Now let's zoom all the way out and ask the biggest question of all. Who is this deployment really for? Is it for the United States? Partly yes. Is it for regional rivals? Absolutely. Is it for domestic audiences to project defiance and control? Without question. And that matters because when a move has multiple audiences, it often becomes harder to reverse. The more public the signal, the more pressure there is to maintain the image. Nobody wants to look weak after sending a message this loud. That can trap both sides into postures that become harder to de-escalate. And in my view, that is what makes this moment so combustible. Not simply the boats. Not simply the jets. Not simply the narrow water. But the fact that every side now has an audience watching. Military audiences. Political audiences. Domestic audiences. Global market audiences. And once all those audiences are in the room, every move carries more weight. So here's my bottom line assessment. Iran's deployment of hundreds of fast attack boats is a serious show of asymmetric maritime intent. It is designed to create leverage, remind everyone of the vulnerability of the Strait of Hormuz, and prove that even under pressure, Tehran can still generate a dangerous tactical picture where geography favors disruption. The rapid U.S. military reaction is equally serious. It signals that Washington and regional commanders are not dismissing this as theater. They are treating it as a potential swarm problem inside a strategic choke point, and they are moving quickly to ensure that if the picture changes, the response is already in motion. One side is trying to crowd the board. The other side is trying to control it. One side is betting on tension, numbers, and geometry. The other is betting on sensors, integration, readiness, and speed. And between those two positions lies the most dangerous factor in modern conflict. Miscalculation. Because boats can be counted. Aircraft can be tracked. Assets can be deployed. But miscalculation is invisible right up until the moment it explodes. That is why the next 24 to 72 hours matter so much. Watch for changes in patrol density. Watch for public imagery releases. Watch for escort posture around commercial shipping. Watch for helicopter and fighter activity. Watch for any reports of close maritime contact, warning shots, or aggressive maneuvers. Because if this remains a messaging contest, the region may breathe through it. But if messaging slips into movement and movement slips into confrontation, this whole story can go from tense to historic in a very short amount of time. And that is the board right now. Hundreds of fast attack boats. A rapid U.S. military reaction. A global choke point under pressure. And a reminder that in the Gulf, it does not take a battleship to shake the world. Sometimes all it takes is a narrow strait, a swarm of small craft, and a few very bad decisions made at very high speed. Let me know what you think. Do you see this as pure deterrence theater? Do you think this stays in the signaling phase? Or do you think we are looking at the early shape of a much bigger confrontation in the Strait of Hormuz? Drop your take below. And if you want, in the next message I can turn this into either